2020.
Dan, so you say you think Apple marches to 300 a share here, which would be about 10% higher, maybe even 350 on 5G iPhone. But what's the downside? What's the worst case scenario that could keep that from happening?
Look, I think worst case scenario just got taken off the table in terms of the tariffs, what we saw. That was really the dark cloud over Apple in terms of China. And I think right now you go through with the supercycle, I think the only risk that we potentially see is Chinese demand. But we just did our China checks. That continues to be above expectation. So right now I think it's a green light. I view this as a stock that will have a 3 in front of it going into next year. And this took away the dark cloud, what we saw this morning. That's the focus for tech investors, Apple and semis going higher.
Dan, what do you say? Where's the upside? Is it in iPhone? And can upside in wearables and services, which really don't contribute that much to profits and revenue, still help sentiment?
Yeah, look, I think if right now the setup is iPhone, Rock of Gibraltar, I continue to think 185, 190 million units and a super cycle going into next year. But if you look at AirPods, and that's going to be 4 or 5% of revenue, we're predicting 85 to 90 million units next year with services. The re-rating is starting and continuing to happen. Some of the parts, I view it that services business is worth $600 billion.
Gene, it seems to me that you didn't think that these tariffs were ever actually going to impact Apple because of perhaps the relationship between the president and Tim Cook. But shares right here are higher for Apple, albeit just slightly, about 0.4%. Where do you think they go from here?
So I'm more optimistic than Dan. Dan, by the way, is more optimistic than most of the sell side. I think that, and I want to pick up, I love Dan's work, I want to pick up on the concept of supercycle, which undoubtedly will be one of the themes that we're going to hear going into 5G. As a quick aside, the first year of 5G for the iPhone will be a disappointment for investors. I think that ultimately, this is a massive opportunity for Apple, a huge play on 5G, but it's going to take time for the networks to roll out coverage. But I want to go back to the phrase supercycle. That, to me, is really the core of how most investors still think largely about the Apple story. Is this, you kind of own it going into big cycles, and I think that is in part what is moving the stock higher. But to answer your question, where I think this can go, I think that this ultimately can be a $350 or $400 stock. And I base that on a belief that we're going to gravitate over the next 2 years to a view that this is more of a consumer tech staples company growing much faster than companies like Coca-Cola and Procter & Gamble, should deserve a multiple closer to 25 or 30 times. And I understand that is a departure from this supercycle view over the last decade in covering Apple. But I think ultimately wearables, services, this whole kind of symphony of products working together is going to influence investors to rate this higher over time.
Gene, if the 5G iPhone supercycle is a disappointment, arguably the 5G rollout in the U.S. is going to be a disappointment, right? I mean, that's the main device that a lot of people are expecting are going to sell this network. Is it that you think that Apple's not going to have the software and services ready in 2020 to entice people to buy a phone like that that's a 2021 story?
I need to be clear because the word disappointment is a important word, and I chose that wisely. Ultimately, is that the stock is going to move higher next year. I think that this is going to be one of the best performers, if not the top tech performer next year as well. So I just want to be clear about that. I think the hype around 5G is going to grow. I also want to answer your question is that this is not an Apple-related problem. The disappointment is, I think, largely on the shoulders of the carriers who have talked, I think, a lot about the 75% coverage by the end of next year. I think that is optimistic at the best case. And so as I kind of fast forward, there'll be 5 iPhones next year. I think the stock continues to move higher, but investors should have a sober view about how that first year, this would be calendar 2021 largely, that first year of 5G sales. The good news is it's going to happen. We will get an incredible lift in iPhone. I'm reluctant to use the phrase supercycle, but we will get a massive lift over the next few years. It's just investors need to be patient in that first year because the coverage won't be there.
Dan, is that your view, or how wedded are you to the idea of the first 5G iPhone, in fact, having a supercycle?
Yeah, and Gene, as always, brings up great points. I think it just comes down to the math doesn't lie. 900 million iPhones worldwide, 350 to 400 million of those are going to be in upgrade cycle over the next 12 to 18 months. You kind of do the math on that and just attach rate on services and AirPods. That's how I think this is a stock that continues to move higher. Do you get disappointed on a sort of mix of 5G and 4G into next year? I think it's possible, but ultimately our China checks show the initial reads in terms of units north of 200 million. That's the line in the sand. If that holds true, this is a stock that goes much higher from here, especially with the gut punch, the 160 billion now off the table. That's the key.